Hi, it's Jessi. Today I'll be drinking the vanilla mead from Honey Hole Winery, diluted with some seltzer water because this is sweet. In addition to that, I also have a massive stack of books because I'm coming to you today with some book recommendations. Last week, we'll say it's last week, I'm not sure when I'm going to upload at this point, I made a video about some pet peeves I had, and one of them was that epic fantasy fans tend to pick a series and reread it over and over again. And it has been my mission for, 3-4 years now to get Wheel of Time fans to read literally anything besides Wheel of Time. And in an effort to do that, I'm going to be recommending books specific to Wheel of Time fans based on what you, Wheel of Time fans, said you liked about the series. I posted on Twitter and also on several different Facebook groups to ask people what they loved about Wheel of Time, what made them keep coming back to it, what made it so special they wanted to reread it 37 times. And now I'm going to go through some of those things and recommend books. My promise to you is that I will not mention the Dandelion Dynasty until the very end, because I didn't want this to be a Dandelion Dynasty video. But I kid you not, most, if not all of the comments I got, I could have recommended Dandelion Dynasty for. But we'll come back to that at the end. In the meantime, we're going to go ahead and jump into the recommendations I have. This is broken down into some few broad categories that sometimes have subcategories in it, just to kind of get an idea of, I got this comment or a comment like this a lot, and here's something or some things I think could fit within that. So our first category is going to be just nostalgia. I got a lot of comments that were a variation on, I read this at a special time in my life and it takes me back to that time.
It's the series that made me a reader, and discussing it on the hour-plus bus ride cemented one of my first and longest friendships when I was the new kid in high school.
Or, it's something I know is good, so I keep coming back to it. Or, it feels like being with old friends.
I started reading when I was 10 and reread each time a new book came out, so the characters felt like my real-life friends growing up. I don't remember ever not knowing them. Turning on the audiobooks as an adult feels good, like I'm catching up with old school buddies.
A variation on this is, people that read it when they were younger, read it when they got older, and the series grew with them.
My first read, I related to the younger characters. As I have aged, I've related more to some of the older characters.
It's books that appealed to them when they were younger, and then they saw something different when they were a little bit older. I can speak to my own experiences with that exact feeling with the character of Nynaeve. I hated Nynaeve when I read this book as a teenager. I thought she was annoying. I was like, why doesn't she just let them live their lives? Why is she being so overbearing? And then I reread it again as a young adult in my late teens, early 20s. And suddenly I got it because I had a little brother who was dealing with nonsense. I had friends that kept doing the dumbest things. And it was like, yeah, okay, Nynaeve, I get it now. I get it. And that kind of thing. And now that I'm a little bit older, I feel I relate to Moraine a little bit more in that she's older and actually knows what's going on. And even the Nynaeves of the world are a little losing it a little. So these are kind of hard to recommend something for. I can't go back in time and make you have read something that you can now read and experience in a new way. Or I can't implant memories of you of a beloved series that you have fond memories for. I can't do that. But asking around on Twitter, I got a couple of recommendations for books that could have that feeling. So if you had read them when you were younger, reading them as an older if you haven't read them since then, rereading them now, you might kind of have that feeling. Or my thought was, if there's a kid in your life, 10 to 17-year-old that you would want to recommend books for, these might be books to recommend to them that have that feeling. So 2 on here that aren't mine, these are some I was recommended. One was the Percy Jackson series by Rick Riordan. This is one that I've heard this kind of feeling about before, so it didn't surprise me to see it come up. I just didn't get into these when I was younger. I read the first one and then I chose to read a different Greek mythology inspired middle grade series that just didn't take off in the same way. Whoops. But these, if I feel like a lot of people are very familiar with these. He now has a gazillion other books. He also, I think anything in that Rick Riordan Presents series probably would fit in that bill if you're looking for something from a slightly different culture. Another one with the Chronicles of Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin. I also didn't read these as a kid, and I still haven't gotten into them as an adult, but I've heard that they really grow with you. You can revisit them as an adult and have those fond memories of reading them as a kid, but also you see something different now that you're older. For me, I'm going to recommend one that I didn't read as a kid, but I'm imagining what it would have been like if I had read it as a kid and how it would have impacted me then versus how it impacts me now reading it as an adult, and that's going to be the Locked Tomb series by Tamsin Muir. There's only 2 books out yet. Right now, I have no idea. There's going to be 4. Who knows what Nona and Electa will do for how I feel about this series. But I can just picture teenage me reading these books and seeing something very specific in Gideon and Harrow and the other characters. And now that I'm older, I'm seeing something very different in them. But I'm also relating to different characters. Like, current me, I'm like in a Camilla space. But I could also see myself in 5-10 years being really, really relating to Magnus and Abigail. So I think there's something really interesting in this that could grow with a reader. The second category is going to be one I'm kind of defining broadly as re-readability. This is things that make it worth it to read the book again. You get something more out of it.
The foreshadowing and payoff for sure, and therefore the re-readability that comes with this giant series.
Some of this is foreshadowing, which is, just being able to read it, and you're seeing all those hints, those little breadcrumbs that Robert Jordan left to lead to where the story goes.
The little nuggets the author left that are only found after multiple rereads.
But the other thing is just that everything is so detailed that you learn something a little new every time you pick it up.
There are just so many storylines and points of view. I pick up something new each time.
I'm going to recommend for this the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin. This world is very elaborate, but there is so much little nuggets of foreshadowing in there. Not so much on the level of Robert Jordan. This is a trilogy, not 14 books, but you get little nuggets that pay off by the 3rd book, and it's so well done. Some other books that could fall in here. Kingkiller Chronicles I know is super rereadable. I know there are a lot of fantasy fans that if you love it, you really love it and you read it over and over. Now, I do think some of this looking for breadcrumbs things may be because who knows how any of this is actually going to work out. So that one's kind of a more hesitant recommendation just based on the fact that, I don't really know how much of that foreshadowing is really going to play out. And then one I got recommended on Twitter was the Lycanius trilogy, which is by, I don't remember who that's by. It's the one that starts with Shadow of what was once lost, the Shadow of what was lost. I can't remember who it's by. But I was told this is a really good one where you discover something new every time you pick it up and reread. The next category is going to be themes. I have this kind of broken into 2 different subcategories. The first one is the way men and women interact. Full disclosure on this is that I got a lot of comments that refer to this in different ways, and I'm not sure all of them are ones I agree with. But the general idea here seems to have been that men and women are more or less equal. There doesn't seem to be a lot of, it's not necessarily a comment I agree with, but the idea that women can be powerful and aren't judged for being powerful, nobody's stopping them from being powerful, and I'll talk a little bit more about how that plays out with characters, but just the way men and women interact, I guess.
I loved reading of a world with true gender equality, what that looked like, what it meant. It was truly fascinating to me.
I struggled with this one just because I do think that's something fairly unique to the Wheel of Time. It's also just not necessarily my favorite part of the Wheel of Time personally, so I haven't read a lot of books that have that, and when I asked for recommendations on Twitter, I didn't get a response. So, what I'm going to go with here is the Tenserate series by Neon Yang. This is obviously, this is the whole series. It's much smaller. It's not on the scale of the Wheel of Time. But here, gender is really explored in some very interesting ways, and people aren't restricted at any point because of their gender, which I think really encapsulates what people were saying they liked about the gender dynamics in the Wheel of Time. Some people were saying they liked the conflict between men and women. And I don't know, maybe read Ready Player One then. Okay, the other side of the themes that people said they seemed to like was this subversion of the chosen one trope. It's the reluctant hero.
The deconstruction of the Messiah trope, the detailed examination of the pressures that puts on someone and how they react.
I feel like this is something that has become very common since Wheel of Time came out, that like to the point where reluctant heroes are kind of not what we want, but specifically kind of got into looking at the realities of being a hero and what that would do to your psyche specifically, but also, how that would affect a person. And it's not a chosen one, but I really can't recommend anything better than the Poppy War to really explore this. Like, the idea of the harms of having to save the world and putting a lot of pressure on a young person to do incredible things and what that could do to a person. Nothing is going to get that quite like the Poppy War does. If you want a different recommendation for this, I only ever read the first book, but Dune by Frank Herbert has a chosen one and does kind of go into that same dissecting of what it means to be a chosen one. And I think that could kind of fulfill a similar feeling to what the Wheel of Time does with the chosen one trope. All right, and now we're getting into the bigger categories. The first three were like a few people said it, and I could see where they were coming from. The world building, though. This came up a lot. I have 3 different subcategories that kind of fit under the world building. I'm actually going to start with the smallest of these, which is the battle scenes. I got a few comments of people that just said the way Robert Jordan writes battles and fights and duels was really, really good.
Jordan's battle scenes and duels are also easily the best in literature.
The battle sequences are great. There's a couple where I feel like you blink and wonder how it was over already. But my first read-through, I remember never being able to stop reading if I was in a battle scene.
Problem here is that I don't care. When I read a battle sequence, for the most part, I zone out. So the only example of what I have read that I could think of was the First Law trilogy by Joe Abercrombie. There is a specific duel that happens in, I think, the second book, might have been the third book, that I could visualize. And that to me says a lot. If I can visualize a battle scene, that's pretty good for me. One of the comments I got specifically mentioned Pierce Brown's books. I haven't read it, but they said it was pretty good. And then I started asking other people, and just about everybody is just like me and doesn't really care. Zones out during fight scenes, can't picture them, can't visualize them. Just a quick rapid fire of some of the things they mentioned that have good fight scenes. Malazan, the craft sequence, I'll talk about all of these later, by the way. Stormlight Archive and Greenbone Saga, all of those kind of got briefly mentioned as something that also has like at least 1 or 2 standout fight scenes. So those are some recommendations there. If you have better recommendations for authors or series that have good battle sequences, please leave them below, because this is just not something I read for, so it wasn't really something I could recommend very well. Moving on though, one of the other parts, probably the biggest part of the world building that people consistently lauded about the Wheel of Time, was the cultures.
On top of that, the detailed world Jordan built with the various cultures and mannerisms, then weaving all that together in an epic tale.
And there were a lot of comments on this that got more specific, less specific. Some people liked the gender-based magic, the blend of Eastern and Western cultures, the cyclical use of time, the impact of history. There were a lot of very specific things that people liked, but the general idea that people wanted and enjoyed the Wheel of Time for was that the cultures felt fully realized. They felt large and complicated and really fleshed out. So to that end, I'm going to be recommending books that have that kind of fleshed out culture.
The world building and immersion is still on its own level. The world, its cultures, and characters feel plausible and real when you're reading it.
I'm also going to talk a little bit about if you're looking for a non-Western, not European-based fantasy. These are some recommendations. I don't think I've read anything that has that blend of cultures, because I think the thing with Wheel of Time that's unique about the way Robert Jordan built things, it's not like he just took ideas and meshed them together and melted them. It's not a melting pot. You can still pull out those little things when he built a culture. So it's almost like a marbling where you can see how they intersect and meet and things like that. I don't think I've ever read anything that has that kind of effect. A lot of the fantasy and sci-fi that I've read seems to kind of keep to, we chose this area or this culture to be inspired by. So to that end, depending on what culture you're interested in reading more of, or what cultures you'd be interested in something being more inspired by, Rebecca Roanhorse's of Earth and Sky, Between Earth and Sky series, starting with Black Sun. This is pre-Columbian inspired, so if you're interested in those cultures and seeing how they might take on a fantasy world, this could be a recommendation for you. I know The Rage of Dragons by Evan Winter has, African inspired. Didn't do much for me, but that might be something you would be interested in. Asian fantasy is exploding, so you can find Asian inspired fantasy if that's specifically what you're interested in exploring. For world building, though, that kind of takes little bits and pieces and is interesting and still relates to our real world, I would recommend P. Jelly Clark's things. He does alternate histories, and they're just so fascinating, whichever one you take, whichever one you look at. The main one is going to be his Dead Djinn universe, which is like it takes place in Egypt, so it's inspired by a lot of those cultures, obviously. And that could really kind of fulfill that same niche. But if you're looking for just a complicated cultures, deep, messy cultures, the way they interact, but not necessarily that real world inspiration that Wheel of Time has, I'd recommend The Wayfarers by Becky Chambers. This has alien races that have some of the most interesting cultures. And they're cultures that to me are more fascinating because they're built based on the biology of these creatures, and their biology is of course influenced by their home planets and the environments they're in. And so that whole thing from the sci-fi perspective of it is just fascinating. But it really is the cultures that she builds in that series are really, really cool. So if you're looking for cultures that are maybe less recognizable for the real world, that would be a series I recommend. And then, of course, Robert Jordan's magic system got a lot of praise.
The complex magic system that sort of made sense.
And praise in very interesting ways. Some contradictory, I think, is the way I would put it, because some people were like praising how the magic system was a hard magic system that you could really understand, and other people were praising that it's clear there are internally consistent rules, but you could kind of do what you want with it. And like I said, contradictory, but people really like his magic system. And I think if you want that kind of contradiction, the thing I like in a magic system, and this is obviously putting my own spin on it, I like a magic system that has rules, and you as the reader might just not know what the rules are. And I think to get that experience, which to me seems to be the Wheel of Time experience, the craft sequence by Max Gladstone would really do it. This is book 3 or 5, depending on which order you're reading in. But I think that would really scratch that itch. If you're looking for something with more of a hard magic system, I mean, I don't read a lot of hard magic anymore. Greenbone Saga works, Broken Earth. There's a bunch of options there if that's something you're looking for. The last category is going to be characters, but before I get in there, there's kind of this in-between category where people really, really praised the complexity of this series. And there seemed to be an intersection between the complexity of the culture and the world building and the history and all of that, but also the complexities of the characters and how realistic the characters are and how those two things interact.
No other story has as many converging and diverging plots, building and rippling off of each other.
It's the detail. So much detail. As someone who can't visualize, Wheel of Time immerses me.
So I'm kind of doing this kind of middle category, which is just the scope, the detail, the complexity.
Many layers of cultures, many layers of character, Many layers to the magic system. Everyone and everything having rules that clash, get broken, get reformed.
I like the depths of the characters. None of them are perfect, and that allows the reader to relate and empathize with them, which in turn creates a sort of bond to the characters and books.
If we're being real, a big part of that is just going to be it's a 14-book series. I don't read a lot of series that long. Actually, I've currently not read anything remotely close to that long. I mostly stay in my trilogy lane. That said, there's a couple I'm in the process of reading, so just this is kind of coming from a space of this is just not necessarily going to fulfill all of those expectations just because I'm talking about things that are on a smaller scale. So to talk specifically about that complex world, I think what I'm going to recommend is Malazan, Book of the Fallen. This is the second book. I'm only, 1.25 books into the series, so take this with a grain of salt. But everything I understand is that this world is complex and full and really insane and fully realized. So if that's what you're reading Wheel of Time for 100,000 times, maybe try giving the Malazan universe a chance. And I know besides just the 10 books and Books of the Fallen, there are a bunch of like spin-offs and stuff. So I'm sure that world continues to grow. For characters, my recommendation, this is going to be kind of a weird one, is going to be the Inheritance trilogy by N.K. Jemisin. This is the bind-up edition, so like this is the whole thing. But largely when people were talking about the characters, they talked about how flawed they were and how that made them relatable. But also just they were complex and they interwove, and I think this really hits this. It kind of gets the world thing too, just because of the way the world evolves with the characters, and I really love that. But I think this really scratches that itch for something that, the characters are complicated and messy, and I think this fits that. But if you're really looking for something that does both, I think my best recommendation for you is going to be the Realm of the Elderling series as a whole. That's, 14 books? 3, 6, 9, 12, 16 books. But specifically, I'm going to focus in on the 5th series. So that's going to be the 1st series, the 3rd series, and the 5th series, which follow Fitz. Starting, of course, with Assassin's Apprentice and the Farseer trilogy. Just because these characters really do, they're real. And the world, and they impact each other. This also, I really could put this in a lot of things. I feel like this fits that theme of like the psychology of like being the chosen one and how that actually impacts you. And I could definitely put it in foreshadowing, probably. I don't know, I haven't finished, so I couldn't honestly tell you. I really do think this is a good series that could evolve with the person. So I feel like I could have put Realm of the Elderling, Farseer, any of these in like a lot of categories. But as far as where it fits the best, that scope, the complexity, the detail, this is what this has it. And that, of course, moves us into our final category, which, like I mentioned, is the characters. This, again, I have broken down into like 3 subcategories. So the first one is characters that feel like old friends.
For me, it was the characters. I grew up with those kids from Emmons Field.
This, again, goes a little bit back to, like, you read it when you were a kid, and you've read it so many times that it's familiar.
All the characters are flawed and complex. Thus, I am able to relate to them.
But a lot of this had to do with characters that were flawed in believable but likable ways. I think that's a big key to this, is that the characters are likably flawed. So, like, as much as I love the Broken Earth trilogy, Nasun doesn't quite fit the bill. But characters that are flawed, that feel real, they feel like somebody you could get a beer with, that kind of vibe. So when it comes to characters being realistic, I have a couple standalones. I've been trying to avoid standalones for this because obviously I think if you're reading The Wheel of Time and you want something to fill that void, you want something big. But for a couple standalones, Winter's Orbit by Everina Maxwell, those characters are messy. But they're messy in the way that like watching a reality TV show is kind of messy. Or they're messy in the way that you kind of want to wrap them in a warm hug and like take them down and sit down and talk about it, kind of messy. And in a very similar vein, The Goblin Emperor by Catherine Arden. Same thing. Like that main character is just when you can feel the reality. This, of course, is going to be very skewed by my own feelings and interpretations, where I find awkward characters in uncomfortable, socially anxious situations really relatable. So those two are definitely going to skew towards that, but I do think it makes them real. But if you want flawed, messy characters that feel real, that you get to know, that are somebody, maybe not all of them. I don't think I'd sit down for a drink with any of them. Just doesn't seem like the right move. But like they feel like they could be your old friends. Greenbone Saga. I think the entire Call family, from Grandpappy all the way down to the little baby, I think they all feel like realistic characters. And they feel like people I want to get to know. Maybe. It gets complicated when you get into the details of that series, but like the character work in there, just brilliant. Really haven't read anything remotely close to it. For the next characters, the next section was character growth. So this is specifically characters go through trauma, go through things, and they come out of it different, and they come out of it changed. And one of the quotes is specifically about how the characters at the end are barely recognizable as the characters from the beginning.
The character growth is some of the best in fiction.
And I do think this is a brilliant, beautiful part of the Wheel of Time series, where if you look at literally any of the main characters, any of the Emmons Fielders, any of the other main characters, really, what is a main character in the Wheel of Time? We don't need to get into that. But at the end of the series, who they are is so fundamentally different from who they were at the beginning, but they're still recognizable, which I think is an important part of this.
The character growth and suffering of the characters. Every character suffered and grew as a result, becoming unrecognizable from their earlier selves as the series progressed.
So I have 2 recommendations for this. One of them is a graphic novel. Now, I fully acknowledge that not everybody that reads big epic fantasy series are actually interested in reading graphic novels. But the Monstrous graphic novel series, the character growth in there is just so good. You know, it's only 6 volumes in, it's not finished yet, but our characters go through so much, and I love seeing them grow and change and learn to accept people, and you know, it's good to see. And it's not necessarily the same growth you see in the Wheel of Time, but I think that's probably for the best, because you don't want to see the same thing, you just want to see something that has those characteristics. And then the other one I'm going to recommend is going to be the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. Now obviously I'm not done with this. I mean, there's only 4 books out. I've read 3 of them. Somebody can tell me where I can get my hands on a mass market paperback edition of Rhythm of War, I'd be very grateful, because my Barnes & Noble apparently isn't stocking it. Anyway, and I just think these characters really, if you want trauma-induced character growth, I think this might be it. This might be it. And then finally, the last part, and perhaps, how do I say this? I think for sure this is the thing that probably most people that have taste to me view as the biggest positive of the Wheel of Time, but also think could be done way better. And that's how I'm going to put it. And that's going to be the women in the Wheel of Time.
It's the women, the Aes Sedai, the Athanmir, the Kin, the Suldam, the Damane, the Forsaken, Egwene, Nynaeve, Moiraine. Powerful women doing cool shit.
That there are women in power, that there are very strong women, that the women characters are flawed and complex and not just there for set decoration. What I will say is I've recommended, a lot. I have like 10 books just sitting around me that I've recommended, and I know there were a ton more that I don't own or have on me, like 3 of these are library books. I would say if you just picked one at random out of a hat, it probably features strong women. Maybe not this one as much. Yeah, that, women. This one's okay. Not so much that I've seen there. Definitely cool women, awesome women, love them all. Women and women and women. I like books with strong women, so if I've recommended it, it probably has pretty awesome women in it. Not necessarily guaranteed, but Probably. Anyway, but if I'm gonna recommend some new stuff with some awesome ladies in it, my favorite's gonna be probably the Memoirs of Lady Trent. As the title implies, it's about Lady Trent. Lady Trent's amazing. She's great, and she also, as the series goes on, gets some really great friends. So these cool women doing cool things. Don't have it, The Iron Widow. It's only one book out so far, but I think it's gonna be, I don't know how many books it's gonna be. I know there's a second book coming at some point. But The Iron Widow is just all about women empowerment and women taking control. This is a YA, so it's not going to appeal to everyone, but it's pretty good. And then going back to Realm of the Elderling, Live Ship Traders series, starting with Ship of Magic. Yeah, definitely full of great women. And what I like about this one, that the other ones I've mentioned have to some extent, but what I really like about this is that it's not just women heroes. Like, there are women villains, there are women that do the right thing, and women that do the wrong thing, and women that do it for the right and the wrong reasons, and we see younger women and older women, and I really like that about Live Ship Traders. It's very diverse in its female representation. And that's it. That was, I don't know, like 24 book recommendations for Wheel of Time fans. Please, I am begging you. I'm begging you. I would get on my knees if you could see me, but you wouldn't. Wheel of Time fans. After you've read The Wheel of Time, I don't know, 12 times, I'd give you a solid number on this, but really anything more than like 3 times without reading anything else seems high for me. I'm just begging you, please read something. I didn't even talk about the Dandelion Dynasty. You know what? I'm going to make that a whole other video. I will make a whole separate video about why Wheel of Time fans should read the Dandelion Dynasty. Feels like a very niche video, but I'll make it. Anyway, this has probably been really long, and it's just me listing books for the most part, but go ahead, leave a like, share this around. Please share this one around. And leave a comment if there's any of these categories where you think there's a different book that I didn't recommend and I should have. I will say there's a lot of overlap with a lot of these books. I could have recommended Poppy War. I already said about a million things I could have recommended Poppy War for. This could have been Great Women, complex character growth, not in the same way as Wheel of Time. Old Friends, maybe not in the same way. Men and women are viewed more or less equally. Really cool cultural, most of these books could have been recommended for a variety of things. So chances are if you pick up one of these because of one thing, you're gonna like other things. If you want more information on that, go ahead and leave a comment below about like, hey, I'm kind of interested in this, but does it also have this element? And myself or somebody will answer you, I'm sure. Anyway, this has been the longest outro ever, so I'm just gonna go. Bye.